And we're live. Welcome to the Nest, everyone. Hey, Nesties and Besties. I am here live with our Making Magic panel, and I am with New York Times bestselling authors Kendare Blake, Samantha, Shannon, Gina, Chen, and bestselling author Gabe Novoa. Gabe, you have no idea how happy I am to be able to say bestselling author Gabe Novoa after we chatted last March. Welcome to your panel, everybody. We're going to be talking about all things making fantasy, magical world building. And back when I was conceptualizing the idea of OwlCrate-A-Con in its baby stages back in January, I was thinking to myself, I'd really like to get Gina, Gabe, Samantha, and Kendare in a panel together, and I did it. Welcome to the chaos, everybody. We're going to be talking about dragons. I am going to ask everybody to very quickly give me an elevator pitch. I'm going to start with Gina. Gina, who are you?
Yes, I am Gina Chen, author of Violet Made of Thorns, which is about a prophet who sometimes lies, who gets entangled with a cursed prince. And they have a hate hands. I love to pitch it as, what do you call it? I can fix our meats, I can make him worse. And it's a terrible mess. It's supposed to be like a fairy tale ending, but it's a little bit of a twisted fairy tale. So if you like Ella Enchanted but grown up, that's sort of the story for you.
That's awesome. Good pitch. Gabe?
Hi, I'm Gabe Novoa, author of The Wicked Bargain, a YA Latina fantasy about a transmasculine, non-binary pirate on a mission of revenge, redemption, and revolution in the aftermath of a deal with the devil gone wrong. Next year, I actually have 2 new books releasing. The first is Most Ardently, a queer Pride and Prejudice retelling in which the second eldest, Bennett, is a trans boy and Darcy is gay. And then The Diablo's Curse is the second book, and that's about an ex-demon who gets shipwrecked on a murderous island with the extremely cursed boy who hates them.
All very exciting. I'm very looking forward to Most Ardently. Samantha.
Hi, I'm Samantha Shannon. I'm the author of The Roots of Chaos Cycle, which is currently The Priory of the Orange Tree and A Day of Fallen Night. And those are absolutely massive dragon books, which are about basically a world where there are 2 kinds of magic. And when one of those kinds of magic goes out of control, it causes a massive volcano to give birth to many, many dragons, and a lot of chaos follows. My next project is a bit unusual. I've completely revised my debut novel, The Bone Season, and that will be coming out again in August this year, 10 years after it was published.
OwlCrate's Corey is very excited for that because it's one of her favorite series, The Bone Season. I know she's got it on pre-order already. And Kendare, I know you very well. You know me very well. But for everybody else, can you give us an elevator pitch?
Yeah, although I am super excited about Samantha's revisioning of The Bone Season. That's just such a massive, awesome undertaking to, be able to reissue that. So I hope we get to pick your brain a little bit about that today because I'm very interested. I'm Kendare Blake. I am the author of 3 Dark Crowns, Anna Dressed in Blood, which is behind me, and Buffy the Next Generation, which the final book in the Buffy the Next Generation trilogy comes out this January. My next book is a fantasy set in the same universe as 3 Dark Crowns. It's called Champion of Fate. And it's kind of like if you took the Wonder Woman Amazons and just smashed them together with the Jedi Order. It's like the vibe.
And there's magical ponies.
Yes, there are magical ponies too. They're very mean, but we love them.
Great pitch.
Let's dive right into it because we have lots of wonderful questions for everybody today. And I'm going to start off with Gina. I think we're just going to go round table. When it comes to crafting a captivating world, what elements do you prioritize in your stories so that your readers feel engaged and immersed?
I think that first you have to understand your audience. You have to understand, first you have to understand yourself. Like, what do you what do you find magical in the world, right? And it's a combination of experiences and settings and the people you meet. It all comes together, right? So when we think about worlds, maybe we think mostly about setting, but I think it's mostly about the feeling of walking through that setting. So you have to think about the cultures around you, the dialogues happening around you, where the character themselves are from, especially when you're like talking about like a fish out of water, an immigrant, those kind of people. Everything is different when you're translating through that. And you know, there's anxiety through that, but there's also magic through that. It's the discovery for the first time. I think there's also like a difference between when you're working with a character who is in a very familiar place versus like a very new place. So if you're in a new place, you get to kind of play with that more because it's like, oh, it is magical. I'm like walking into this world for the first time. But if you have a character that's very familiar with that place, what I'd also like to do is sometimes write like a scene about what, like when they were maybe a child and they were experiencing the world for the first time. I really loved writing that in Violet when she was talking about like as a child climbing the walls and running through the streets, something that she cannot do anymore because she's no longer 6.
That's awesome. I really believe that when it comes to creating a memorable world, the magic is in the details. So somewhat similar to what you were saying, actually. The worlds from books that have stuck with me the most are the ones that felt like they had a history. You know, the ones with myths and established belief systems. So I think creating a world with rich context, a world that feels lived in, not just by the characters on the page, but also the characters who have come before them, I think is really key to creating a world that feels real and immersive and that readers want to get lost in.
Oh, Gabe, you took my answer. I was going to say, yeah, like a world with layers. And it's very similar to what you were saying in that you don't want it to feel like a sandbox where you're kind of building around your character. You want to know the characters who came before and also the characters who might come after, what this world did look like, what it might be growing into. Another thing I personally really value when I'm building worlds is thinking about languages. How are the characters communicating with each other? I have a really strong interest in etymology, so that's something that I think about straight away, especially when you have characters who are from, you know, incredibly different countries, for example. You know, are they going to be able to speak the same language? What's going to happen when they meet? So that's something I think about a lot.
I'm last, so I don't answers. I'm like, oh.
You can start first the next time.
Yeah.
Cool.
Like, okay, so sometimes a world comes to me with a concept first. Like 3 Dark Crowns, you know, it was okay, well, on this island, every generation of queens, when they turn 16, they just have to murder the crap out of each other. Got it. That's like the hook of the world. That's the crux of our problem that we're walking into. But then some of the most fun things for me then is to populate this world with characters that make sense within it, and just finding that human element of, okay, who's going to go through these trials and tribulations, and you know, just, yeah. So I don't know, sometimes it goes backwards too. Sometimes I'll build a world around a character if the character is kind enough to show up first. So they both just have to meld together.
And do you approach each of your stories in the same way when you're building your immersive backgrounds? Or do you find, like Kendare, they just kind of show up?
I'm lazy. So they just show up. I just, you know, I tend to just chuck my characters on the page and then kind of walk around with them. So I'm discovering the world as they're kind of also discovering the world, which is particularly useful if you're writing somebody who's like a tourist. I love that. That's like, because I can get to talk about it like an outsider and I don't have to feel like I'm, you know, getting anything wrong because I'm just a tourist, man. I just see what I see. Yeah, and then, you know, through drafts and everything, it kind of enriches itself. But
I personally like to build in layers, kind of like a lasagna, just because, you know, when you're writing a book, you do so much, right? You're building a world, you're like a little god, but then you also have to build these lives. You're becoming like a whole different person or a whole different cast of people. And you kind of can't hold it in your brain all at the same time. So sometimes you're like, I'm going to write down some of the characters and then I'm going to write some more of the world. And then, oh my God, I just discovered this other thing. So I feel like it just comes to you at different points.
Yeah, I think a lot of times when I've had kind of a conception of a story, it's usually a character or some characters and then like a very specific scene. So for The Wicked Bargain, it was on a ship. For some of my sci-fi books I've written before, it was in a red desert. And so I kind of base it off of like this initial idea and then build out from there. So I know where this begins, but what does it look like if I walk, 10 minutes that way, or if I walk a couple hours in the other direction? And so in that sense, I feel like the process is somewhat similar, but it can have like wildly different results and processes depending on just like what I discover and what I think of as I'm trying to expand outward from there.
Yeah, I normally come up with a key concept. So something like with the Bone Season, it was what if the government was hunting clairvoyance? And then with Priory of the Orange Tree, it was what if I were to do a feminist reimagining of George and the Dragon, where the damsel actually killed the dragon. And then what I do is I ask myself questions. So I will just make a really long list of questions about the world, and then I will force myself to answer them. Now, I might not necessarily use all of those answers in the book, but it's like that, very cliche description of an iceberg, is just the tip of the iceberg is normally what ends up in the book. But I do think you can feel it if the author has the rest of the iceberg a lot of the time. And I find that asking myself all of those questions, even if they don't make it in, I hope that gives a sense that I have thought about this world and that it holds together.
I actually have a really fabulous live question that ties in with what we're discussing. Carolyn Victoria asks, any tips for smoothly incorporating your world building? Because I tend to info dump when I write new worlds.
I'd say for me, that's all in revision. So
Yeah.
I think it's totally fine if you info dump, especially in a first draft, because sometimes that's what you, like the author, need to set up context for yourself going forward. But then it's catching those when you're revising and saying like, okay, maybe I don't need to explain the entire history of this section in the first chapter. Maybe I can copy and paste that and throw it maybe 5 chapters down, or maybe I can take little bits of it and sprinkle it throughout the book. So for me, a lot of that is revisions. And I think I do often tend to info dump in first drafts just to like kind of get myself grounded. It's just a matter of spreading it out later.
Yeah, I think it was Terry Pratchett who said something like the first draft is just you telling yourself the story. So that seems to apply there.
Definitely.
I think another way to think about it is you're probably familiar with taking a lot of notes in school and then reviewing them over and over. And when you're genuinely familiar with the material, it just feels different in your head. You can think about it in a way that, like, I guess, doesn't use all your brain cells, so that at some point you can use those extra brain cells to like, oh, wait, actually it fits like right here, like perfectly. And then you're able to write a better essay than you were maybe like a month ago. And it feels the same way when you start rereading your own draft over and over and over.
Yes.
Yeah, like first drafts exist to be messy, that's why they're called the first. So if you just get really excited about something, a cool detail about your world that you've just thought, go ahead and pop it right in right there. And maybe you'll figure out where it goes later, or maybe actually you'll figure out that it doesn't go anywhere and it's just something that you need to know. But either way, it's a nice place, you don't have to forget it then. It's on the page.
This was interesting when I was revising the Bone Season as well, because one of the main reasons I did it was because when I first wrote it 10 years ago, there was so much information in the first chapter that it was genuinely confusing. Like it actually did more to confuse. I was confused, and I know this. I've been writing this world for 10 years. I know it back to front, and just the amount of information I was receiving, and it didn't have any immediate relevance to what was happening in the plot. So it was just completely overwhelming to read. So what I would do is I would take the information in the opening chapter, which was all necessary information, and I would think, okay, well, when can I apply that to where it has some degree of plot relevance? So rather than saying, these are the police in the dystopian world, and this is what they're called, and this is what they do, why not show a scene, for example, of the main character seeing those police and showing what they're doing?
And depending on the story you're writing, you can also get away with not sharing that much information at all and just allowing the reader to guess from it. And you can trust your reader to do a lot of that work. Sometimes it's like more magical for them to discover it that way. But it also depends on the story you're writing.
Yeah. I have a kind of a heavier question now. I said that they'd all be fun, but I really want to ask everybody this. So what role do you think the concept of believability plays in creating a magical world? And how do you balance that whimsy with plausibility?
I actually answered like a similar question on a panel on YALLFest a while ago. And I think it comes down to like, well, it's a little bit related to what I was saying earlier. It's like, I feel like a lot of fantasy books fall into either like you're building a Game of Thrones world building where everything has to like connect. You have to know where the sewers are and where like everyone's poop goes. Or you're kind of just doing this like poo-poo like magic that, you know, as long as the central conceit kind of makes sense, you're fine, because that's what people are there for. They're there for, you know, I just want to know like, what if this happened? You know, I don't need to know where the toilets are. And I think as long as you're able to, yes, I know, but they're so important. That's why we have a whole book that's like everybody poops. Okay, I think this is very important. But I think it's like, as long as you're aiming for the goal of your book, like you sort of have like like whatever it is you're writing for, whether it's like writing a character's arc, or if there's like a message, if there's some sort of theme, like as long as your whole setting, your whole world building is supporting that, and I think like that's the sort of a believability you need, as long as it doesn't detract from like running toward the finish line of your book.
Yeah, I think believability is interesting in fantasy because you can make just about anything believable as long as you've established it as part of the world or the magic system early. And I think that's something I really love about fantasy, because anything is possible. But that said, I do think the key is establishing it early. So believability is broken in fantasy not when an element is unrealistic or out there, but when you break the rules that you've already established in the world without any kind of foreshadowing or any hint that that's something that's possible. Or if you throw in something completely new at a convenient time, for example. Luckily, if you realize while you're writing, for example, at the book's climax, that you actually need a new world building element or a new magic element in order to make it work, that's what revisions are for.
Yeah, leading on from that, I think the two key things would be stakes and consistency. So like Gabe said, you know, you have to make it so that there is a degree of consistency, like you're not just kind of flinging things out there, but then that in turn helps improve the stakes of the world. Because if there's a world where there is, I mean, you might just want to write a fun world where there is no danger, but if you have a kind of a magic, for example, where you can just pull out any skill, any ability, there aren't really any stakes, because you don't know, the main character might suddenly be able to, I don't know, maybe they've fallen off a cliff and suddenly they can create an invisible wall to save themselves, or a cloud shoots down and sweeps them up, but you haven't established this beforehand. You know, there has to be a degree of tension in thinking, are these characters going to survive? So I think that's really helpful.
Yeah, you do. You have to follow your own rules. I mean, you're allowed to break like one if it's like that's the twist. You know, like, oh crap, they weren't supposed to do that. Now you can, like, that's part of your plot. But you know, lately I've been getting bogged down in the minutia of language. I don't know if this happens to you guys, but I'll go to like, last week, what did I find myself Googling? Ah, yes, ancient Greek euphemisms for penises. And I was like, God, what can I have her call this guy's, you know, like,
I understand.
Root, unit, what did they call it back then?
Root.
And the things I found were like so terrible. Like, I don't care anymore what you guys used to call it. I'm not using any of these ridiculous euphemisms. So like sometimes I get really, you know, like caught up in like, I can't have anachronisms. It has to be, you know, true to period, true to tone. And then sometimes I'm just like, no, I'm just going to call it a wang and I don't even care.
I really feel you on that.
Oh yeah, I was gonna say while writing The Wicked Bargain, especially, like Google Ngram was like my best friend. I'm like, is this a word that they would have used in the 1800s? I don't know.
Yeah, I got so hung up on this because I remember when I was writing The Priory of the Orange Tree, I decided that I wanted all the language to feel really Elizabethan. But then I was getting to the point where I didn't want to use words that had been created after a certain time, which was insane. So I remember one day I was sitting at my friend's house and I was like, oh my God, I can't use the word campfire, because campfire surprisingly was invented quite late. And my friend was like, Samantha, this is insane. You're behaving insanely. And I was like, no, you're right, because I've probably removed about 60% of the English language at this point. So yeah, but I do have certain rules, like for example, words like champagne, you know, that specifically refers to a region in France that doesn't exist in my world. And there's a lot of words similar to that. So you have turquoise, which comes from the word Turkey, indigo, which is from India. So I try to kind of limit those in order to make the language feel consistent. But yeah, I think way too much about language and you can get into a real twist over it.
I would argue though that goes back to like the details of what can make a world feel real. So I wouldn't say you can get. I mean, you probably can get too bogged down in it, but I wouldn't totally say it's unreasonable to do that.
I mean, I think
There's
it's
a good payoff.
reasonable, but
Yeah.
you know.
But did you leave
have to do
campfire?
I think I did leave campfire because I was like, I just thought it was so funny because I was like, well, surely the word camp was invented and fire was invented, sorry, so I can just put them together. But yeah, but then I thought, you know, my other book, the next book in the series was going to be inspired by the medieval era, so I would have even fewer words to draw from, and it would just, yeah, it just seemed a bit silly after a while. But I do agree, you can never think about language too much.
I just had a really good live question from Ariel Robin, who asks, is there any one element you always need to put into your world no matter what, or do the worlds demand their own elements each time?
Before writing a pure historical fiction book, I would have said magic, but that's no longer true for me, I suppose. But I really do like having some kind of magic in worlds whenever possible. It's just something that I find like incredibly fun to be able to customize book to book to book. So I wouldn't say it's necessarily like vital for a book, but it is something I really enjoy doing.
I had a reader once tell me years ago that I have intestines in every one of my books. So I do try to do that going forward. I just try to have someone's intestines show up outside of their bodies.
I'm glad you specified outside because I was like, well, surely most of the characters do have intestines. I'd be concerned if they didn't, but
a tangent. But sometimes, do you ever think about what your characters are aware about, like scientifically? I feel like that's also always part of the world. I'm like, do they know how their bodies work? I'm like, would they have been educated at this point? So it's like, do they know they have intestines inside the body? Did they call them intestines?
What are great euphemisms for the intestines?
All right. Tangent accepted. If you couldn't call a character's intestines, what would you call them?
Oh no.
Like entrails or guts or something? I don't know.
Guts feels modern to me, but
say
entrails, I guess.
Yeah.
I'm going to say middle noodles.
Oh, I love
Noodles.
Yeah.
Internal spaghetti.
Dinner.
Forbidden spaghetti. There you go.
That's good. Like, don't insult them or they will spill your middle noodles all over.
Like a really dramatic scene, and he'd be like, "Oh no, it's middle noodles. Come here."
Middle noodles.
All right. Now, which of you is going to use the term middle noodles in a novel? Hands up. No, I'm just kidding. Thank you, Samantha. Okay. Morgan asks, and I didn't know this, so I don't know whether or not this is something you folks know. Why is it secretly illegal to use the term birthday in fantasy novels?
Oh yeah, we all say like name day, don't we? I think I said birthday in A Day of Fallen Night actually, because I had the same dilemma. But then I thought, did George R.R. Martin? Because there is a word name day, but it means something slightly different. It's like the day that you're the saint that you were named after. I think that's your name day. But then I always have this dilemma, like, is this a fantasy word or did George R.R. Martin create it? I'm not quite sure if he used name day like that sort of first or not, but anyway, I don't know why we can't say birthday. Maybe it just sounds too modern, but I did use it, I think.
Yeah.
And then you have the other problem, which is like half the main characters are orphans. So when are they born? They don't know either. My birth, like time of year, somewhere in the season, according to the grandmother who found me by the river. So,
best guess today.
I honestly don't remember if I used birthday or not, and I'm thinking about the Wicked Bargain because it opens on Maud's birthday, and I'm like, did I say birthday? I think I might have said day of their birth, so maybe not. Maybe we're all doing this without even thinking about it.
Well,
I'm looking it up. When was it created? Late 14th century, Old English.
So it's totally allowed.
It's allowed.
Maybe it's just one of those words that even though it isn't new, it sounds or feels newer.
Makes you think of like a little hat and like do you what do you call it? Do you like horoscopes or those kind of personality tests for your characters? And then when you go down like a line of like you kind of go down a rabbit hole, you're like, oh no, like their personality totally doesn't match up like with their star chart or something like that. That's the other
That's
problem.
a good question. I feel like that would be a really easy way to like scope out your characters and their motivations and how they would think and feel. Note to self, though.
I just think a lot of people have fun with that. Like I know a lot of readers have fun with
Yeah.
that extra content where they're like, oh, this would be their star chart. So.
I hadn't thought of that, but I love that idea. I do also have a really bad habit of being like, this is going to be the character's personality. And then I start writing and it's like nothing like what I said it was going to be. So
I was going to ask a different question, but I love this one that just came in from Pippin that says, when I am writing fantasy, I can create a detailed world and characters, but I struggle finding plot. Do you have any advice for creating plot in fantasy?
I think your character needs a prop, like as in your character has to want something. That's usually the main problem I think people run into. Their character doesn't want something enough. They need to like it means just changing their motivation, and then you will discover the rest.
Yeah, similarly, I think I start with the inciting incident. So that's the incident that sets the character on the journey. So essentially, what does the character want and what stops them from getting it? And what is it that makes them have to go get what they want? So once I start from that kind of incident of like, what is the thing that totally changes their lives, basically, the plot can build from there. If I'm having trouble, I do like reaching to some resources. Like there's 3,000 iterations of Save the Cat, which I recommend wholeheartedly if you struggle with plot. I found that really useful and having some kind of framework to think about. But for me, yeah, I like to start with basically what is the incident that completely changes my character's life and makes it so that they can't stay the way they are.
And murder their parents.
Murder their parents.
Everyone,
I mean, that could be the incident. Listen, parents dying is a great inciting incident sometimes.
The incident could be they murdered their parents. Why?
That also could be, yes.
I was expecting something darker from you, Samantha.
It's not dark enough?
I'll take that as a compliment, thank you.
Hey, I've read Priory. Just to remind everybody, Myra, who is our amazing marketing manager behind the scenes, our department head for marketing, will be choosing some winners. And during this panel today at OwlCrate-A-Con, you're going to be able to have a chance to win a massive fun fantasy bundle from Title Pieces. And they're going to be giving away awesome bookmarks, book pops, that sort of thing. We also have copies of Zara by S.J. Jones. That is the ARC. So if you are interested in winning that ARC, please comment so Myra can pick some folks. And we're going to dive into some more questions. I would like to know, can you share any techniques that you use when you're creating a fantasy world or a magical element from scratch? Like, what are your building blocks? Where do you start? And how do you keep track of all of that? Kendare.
No.
You look like
That's a good way to start. No. No, I'm so bad at this. I know so many friends who write fantasies, lovely chunky fantasies, and they are diligent about crafting their series Bibles. You know, as their series stretches into 4 or 5, they'll have like this great document of like all their research and like maps of their family trees and all the different houses and everything. And they're like, yes, it comes in so much handy. And I'm like, yes, it would. And I don't do any of it, like none. I just try to hold it in my brain. And then when inevitably I forget, I just have to, before I started using Scrivener, which makes it easier. Scrivener is much more searchable. Your manuscript is broken down into manageable bytes, but I used to just have to scroll through Word until I found what I was looking for. So I'm not a good advice giver on that.
It's still good to give that advice, though, because I feel like I'm the type of person who wouldn't be able to build that Bible for myself. So it means a lot hearing from an author who is, you know, you're not a plotter, you're a pantser. You kind of go where your story takes you and your characters show up and yell into your ear, right? Same. So it's really nice to hear that you can be like chaotic and kind of go with the flow and still find that like success for yourself as well. Thank goodness, otherwise I'll never write.
I'm the kind of writer who likes to build around obsessions. So I think like you have to really love the thing you're writing about. And then I also build my worlds on things I really like about, or at least know a lot about. And I have a lot of friends who also build on certain periods of history that they're inspired about. And it doesn't mean that it's like a retelling of that exact period of history, but you can kind of understand the interactions between maybe countries or monarchs and see what came out of that. The kind of scandals, everything, there's always scandals up there. So for Violet, I was able to build on my love of fairy tales, and also it kind of loosely touches on American imperialism. So that's very, very fun topic. There's another story I'm building right now that's like a contemporary fantasy celebrity kind of book. And if you're very familiar with K-pop, it is very much built on that knowledge. So I have like 15 years of knowledge of that. So that's very fun.
Yeah, so I talked about this a little bit, but whenever I'm creating a new world, I like to start broad and then drill down into the details. So I first ask myself like what the world looks like as a whole. Is this a medieval Europe inspired fantasy? Something more akin to a contemporary fantasy in a made up world? Is the world dry and arid like a desert, or lush and rich like a rainforest? And then once I have a sense of those major macro elements, I then start getting more detailed. So the town or city the book primarily takes place in, the government structure, religion, food, clothing, class, language, every detail I can possibly think of. And I have found that the more I figure it out up front, the better. But of course, I usually inevitably have to continue fleshing things out later in revisions after taking a draft to really get to know the world and what I want it to look like and feel like. So I do plan a decent amount up front. However, I'm definitely not someone who writes like Kendare said, some people will really go like 50-page, very detailed like world Bibles, and I don't get quite into those details. But I'm probably somewhere more in the middle where I'll like write maybe 10 to 15 pages of handwritten notes that I'll go ahead and I'll look back at later. But that just helps me kind of get an initial context that can help me then get into the world enough to start building on the page as well.
I think people think I'm the kind of writer who has a series Bible, and then they become completely horrified because it's all just up here. The series Bible is in my head. So I do kind of have one. Like I know my world very well, but I'm just very fortunate that I have a good memory so I can hold it together. And it's like, I feel like I kind of switch between different modes. Like I have a priory mode, I have a bone season mode, and it's like I'm putting on glasses and seeing the world through that perspective. So that just seems to be how I think about things. In terms of building worlds, the priory world is pretty strongly modeled on history. Like it was an intentional thing I did because I really like engaging with history. But I think if I were to write actual historical fiction, it would probably take me about 10 years because I'm such a perfectionist. So I like to kind of have fun with history and play with it and kind of examine it through a different lens by examining it through fantasy. So I tend to do kind of wide research about certain historical periods. And then I think, okay, well, these are the events I would like to explore. How would they have played out in this fantasy setting? And how would that be different to how they played out in the real world? And then, like Gabe said, I kind of get down into like smaller details.
That's wonderful. I know that everybody is commenting a lot, and folks are saying I'm learning so much. And I'm just glad that everybody's here so that I can learn more about writing. So on to our next question. Love for Horses had a really great one. Which part of your books is your favorite to write? Do you like the beginning, the climax, character intros, maybe the ending?
Cannot stand beginnings. They stress me out really intensely. Actually, I don't really like endings either. But I think that's because I write the kind of books where people often expect a huge climactic action scene at the end. And if there's one thing I absolutely cannot stand, it's a battle scene. I hate them. Many nights have found me just in tears of panic, realizing I don't know anything about strategy or war, and I have no idea how to plan a battle. So I really hate those. I do like the post-battle scenes where the characters have been injured and now they're all comforting one another. And I really like just intense dialogue. I don't really know why I write novels that require battle scenes, actually, but here we are.
That's the funny part, right? It's like, wait, now I have to be a war general? I was like, I did not sign up for this, but you did kind of sign up for this. I'm like, crap. I just forgot the question because I was thinking about Samantha Shannon as a war general right about now.
Terrible one.
Which part of your books is your favorite to write? Like
yes.
the beginning.
I just hate the middle. I absolutely hate the middle. But I feel like I actually like writing endings a lot, because by the time you get there, it's like, oh, you know what you want to write. Or like, I always know how a story ends when I start writing it. It might change, but I'll always know like what I'm writing toward.
One thing I really like about this is we're all going to have different answers, because I hate writing endings so much. But for me, the reason is I feel like I psych myself out too much. I've written like this entire book and I'm like, oh my God, the ending has to be like amazing, or people are going to read this book and be like, that's how it ended, and throw it across the room. And so I feel like I like really psych myself out and put too much pressure on my endings. That said, I like beginnings. However, I don't like the first page when there's nothing there. Like that is always like the scariest moment, where you're like, I'm literally writing something out of nothing. But once I've like actually started getting going, that's when I really start getting that like initial excitement of like, oh, this world is starting to come together. I'm starting to get to know these characters. And I find that whole process just really exciting and
fun. I'm right now, okay, like I'm at a place in one of my drafts where I am at basically the ending. So it's all like big set piece battle scenes. And I get so physically exhausted. Like I'm just sitting here doing this. And yet by the end of it, I'm like, oh my God, I need some Gatorade. Like I need.
You went through war.
It doesn't make any sense, but it is so taxing in a way that writing the rest of the book is not. I don't know why. I think I might be insane. But I do like writing battle scenes, in that it's fun to think about, like breaking it down John Wick style, like what shots in John Wick would I like to see? Like what parts of the battle would I like to see? What wicked moves do I want to see on the page versus just knowing is going on in the background? But my actual favorite part of a book to write is the food. I love to write cozy food scenes because I'm always hungry. And yeah, I just really, really enjoy it when the characters sit down together after, with a nice warm steaming bowl of something.
I do want to say, I think it's totally fair to be exhausted by the end, though. We've just written an entire book, and that's often in like a long marathon of writing and writing. So I think physically it does make sense to be tired by the time you get to the end, assuming you write chronologically, of course.
Yeah, that answer reminded me. I just really love, and it's so weird, but I just love a hot spring in my books, or like a hot bath. And I think it's because I am a person who is always freezing cold. I don't know why, but then so I'm constantly wanting my characters to have a hot bath or get in a hot spring. So there is quite a lot of that in my books. And I remember with the first draft of the Bone season, Bloomsbury actually had to say to me, Samantha, why is your character having like 5 baths? This is really weird. So there's like a version of the Bone season out there that's like the bath cut. But yeah, that's probably my favorite bit, just when the characters are nice and warm.
Along that vein, I actually love writing snow and winter, which has been tragic because I've been writing all books in the Caribbean lately. But that's one of my favorite things to write, personally, because I just love winter and snow. So it's kind of an opportunity for me to indulge that.
Samantha, I want to say that Corey from Team OwlCrate has said the Bone season series has some of the best fight scenes.
Oh, thanks. I hate every minute of writing them. I think it was fascinating because I just revised the second book, The Mime Order. And when I was reading it back to myself, there's like 2 battle scenes back to back and they each take a whole chapter. And I was like, who is this? Who wrote this? So apparently it was me. And I've realized, is it related to me getting older? Like, did I just have more energy when I was in my early 20s? I think that must have been it, because now I looked at those 2 scenes and I found them completely exhausting. I mean, they're great. I was thrilled to be able to edit them because they were already written. But yeah, thank you. I really appreciate that, because every single one viscerally exhausts me. So I'm glad they read well at the end.
Did you have to re-research for your revision? Like research again, the same stuff again?
Oh, a little bit. So when I was revising the fight scenes, I actually wanted to make sure they were more technically accurate than I thought originally. So I watched a ton of videos that were like knife versus bare hands, just so I could get... Well, because there's like multiple scenes where the characters are fighting, and I was like, I don't know if any of this is like technically accurate at all. So yeah, a lot of very intense videos, but not too much additional research. It was just mostly for stuff like that where I wanted to just refine something a little bit.
Everyone here is on some sort of watch list.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that one was bad.
Multiple members, Myra is letting me know, they want to know, how do you decide on names for your characters?
I'll let someone else answer this first, but this question is
2 hours on Nameberry? I don't know. They have this like cool feature where they show you like related names now. I'm like, I could just get lost doing this. I'm just gonna make a whole list.
Like the baby name site, right?
Yeah, like that is the funniest use of baby name sites. I don't know what the demographics are of those sites. 50% writers, 50% expectant mothers. I don't know.
Isn't it the same thing, really? Birthing a story.
I think I often will start with one name, which is the protagonist name. And once I've settled on a name and been like, okay, this is the right name for the character, I kind of think about like, all right, in a world that this character's, this is the character's name, what would other names be like, So I kind of like to make sure that they all like fit together. So it's not like, I don't know. It's not like Maud Bass and then Timothy. Like that would be so weird, So yeah, I like to make sure that the names all feel like they make sense within the same world, as long as those characters come from the same culture. Of course, if I'm doing multiple cultures, then I basically do the same thing for every culture.
Do you get obsessed with name length? Like I really hate it if there's 2 main characters with 5-letter names or something like that. It just feels weird on the page.
I haven't thought about that, but I haven't learned to be careful about how many characters have the same name that starts with the same letter. Because I once had a draft where my editor was like, I don't know if you realize this, but there are like 10 names / proper nouns that all start with S, and it's really confusing. And I was like, oh, so now I'm really cognizant of that.
Yeah, that's always something to consider. When I was writing 3 Dark Crowns, I deliberately named 2 characters Lucian in the same book because I'm like, that happens in reality, okay? So now there's just 2 of them, and they have different last names, and we're all going to deal with it. So, because I was just rebelling because I did have to change a bunch of. I had too many M names. I'm like, well, I'm just going to throw in 2 Lucians. It's fine. My main characters tend to show up named. Like I think they're very polite in that way. So that takes something off of my plate. But if I could get myself to do a series Bible, it would be the Bible of secondary character names, because that is what I forget. I'm like, what did I call the waiter on page 12? What did I call her butler? Like that kills me. It's just like, I don't think about it when I'm creating these characters. I'm like, they're only going to be here for right now. And then inevitably I need to go back and find them again.
That's why my first draft has plain holders like butler. And so I can go back later and change it.
I find this question fascinating. This is what I always ask other fantasy authors when I interview them, because every fantasy author often has a different answer for it. And so for me personally, the bone season's relatively easy. Like I'll just choose names that suit the character. And then there's these supernatural creatures in it that I name after stars, because there's I just find star names really interesting. Like they come from several different language groups and they have really interesting etymologies. For the primary, the Orange Tree, it took over a year for me to settle on a naming system, and they all just had placeholder names before that. And eventually I decided, because I studied Old English at university, and Old English is fascinating because you can see how it became modern English, but it's also virtually incomprehensible to any modern English speaker. So what I did was I decided to build character names from older forms of existing languages. So there's, just a bunch of languages that I use, like Gothic, Old English, there's quite a few, and I basically just take bits of them and I put them together to create names. So I have this huge intimidating etymology document that's like 8,000 words long and explains where all the character names come from and what they mean.
That is so cool though.
Thanks.
So kind of similar to what Kendare said, I don't repeat the same names, but I usually repeat like the same roots or the same like endings in names if they're coming from the same culture. They're not like super research like Samantha, but I think like that kind of echo when you hear it, when you sort of hear the names in your head, it makes it feel more real.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. One of our live viewers, Morgan, said, I'm naming my daughter Rosarian. I heard that name in Priory of the Orange Tree, and I was immediately in love.
Oh, it's a lovely name. I really like it. That's so sweet.
Now, I'm sure like lots of folks on this panel have had readers either name their pets or their children after your characters. Tell me a little bit about like how that impacts you. That's got to feel really good.
Yeah, no, I have had that happen before. I think somebody said they called their daughter Sabran, and then there was a trans man who messaged me to say that he'd chosen one of my characters' names as his new name, which was lovely. it's just a real privilege, really. But just the general experience of your books having an impact on anyone's life in any way is wonderful. Like, just any messages you get from readers, it just feels like such a privilege that we're able to tell these stories. And thanks to our publishers and translators and all the other people involved in working on our books, you can tell this story and it can be read by someone who lives thousands of miles away from you and impact their lives. And I just think that's a really amazing part of the job.
All the individual connections, we remember all of them. I mean, you remember definitely, like, people always seem to like apologize when they reach out. It's like, oh, you must be so busy. I'm like, no, this is why I write. I write for, you know, hearing you
guys. There's somebody who named a cute baby horse who was just born. I think she's like 6 months old now. They named her after one of the queens in Three Dark Crowns. So now I follow her on Instagram and I get a lot of really cute, you know, baby horse videos. She just posted one the other day of a baby horse. When they start to shed their coat, their butts will get really itchy. So they're like going into you real slow to make you scratch their butts. And she's in that phase right now.
She's in the itchy butt scratchy phase. That's so cute. Giselle Vidarte, by the way, for everyone on the panel requesting food and hot bath scenes for extra bonus content.
Yeah, I should write an extra one just called the bath season. I would love that.
Yes.
Yeah.
You should do that as like a pre-order incentive.
Short stories just from the bath, about the bath.
People would love that. That'd be awesome.
I'm going to ask one of my questions that I chose for this panel. Sorry, live viewers. I think this one's fun and you guys might like it too. What's your favorite magical animal or fantasy element that you've created and what inspired its creation? Kendare, was it the ponies?
Well, I mean, yeah, kind of. All of my animal sidekicks are inevitably my favorite characters to write.
Well, I have a lot of dragons in mine, obviously, but I also have this really fun creature that I based on medieval bestiaries, which is called an ichneumon, which is a Greek word that means tracker. And we think it was inspired by, in the medieval era, people would see mongooses, and mongooses love fighting serpents and serpents. That was really intense of me. Snakes, and they're very good at it. So they're often like immune to venom, and they can actually defeat like cobras. But the medieval imagination imagined that as the mongoose essentially being the enemy of the dragon, because snakes and dragons are so interchangeable. But I thought it was slightly ridiculous to have a tiny little mongoose fighting a dragon. So I made them massive. So an ichneumon is just a massive talking mongoose. And they all have precisely identical personalities, which I think is hilarious. And they're just really fun. And it's funny because readers will say to me, like, I can't picture an ichneumon though. And I'm like, right, imagine a mongoose. And then imagine it massive. That's it. And they're like, but it looks a bit like a wolf in my head. And I'm like, no, it's a mongoose.
It's a mongoose.
Massive. So yeah, they're fun. I enjoyed those.
I really like this monster city I'm building right now because it's full of paranormal creatures, and it's very fun in the way, like when you think of Zootopia, where it's a city, but it's all animals, and like it runs differently because you see all these jokes about, like, you know, animals using their particular animal abilities to make the transportation function or something. So it's similar, but with paranormal creatures. So that's very fun. Like building a whole metropolis, going like, oh, who's running the trams here? It's like it's some creature who's really good at electricity or something like that. So I think that's been really fun to build.
Who's running the trams?
I actually was not thinking that far because I was building it in my head.
We can help now. Okay, everybody, let's go.
like the creatures who call lightning down and, like, I don't know, zap it into the like electrical power building thing. I'm not a scientist, but in theory, it makes sense in my head.
I feel like eels would be like a really likely candidate.
Well,
for that, right?
and then you have the hydropower because it is an island. So then, yeah. But see, this is how you get down the rabbit hole. This is exactly precisely how the rabbit hole starts.
Sorry, Gabe, go ahead.
No, it's okay. I was just gonna say, for me, I think it's more of a favorite element rather than a creature. But I will say that I am a huge Avatar: The Last Airbender and X-Men fan. So it's not surprising that I love playing with elemental magic. And the Wicked Bargain gave me the opportunity to play with elemental magic slightly differently from the way I have in trunked manuscripts in the past. Specifically because the protagonist mod has dueling elemental magical abilities with the ability to control and create both fire and ice. And I will unabashedly say that was totally inspired by Avatar: The Last Airbender. So
It's fantastic how a lot of fantasy is inspired by other fantasy, right?
yeah.
And that's how we continue getting all these new and amazing stories. I am going to let everybody know who won the giveaways. So Myra has picked some names. I'm going to let you know that the Title Pieces bundle has been won by Carolyn Victoria. Congratulations. And These Are Our Arc has been won by Bruce the Girl. Congratulations. That's awesome. And I do want to end on probably one of the most important questions always is, what advice would you give to aspiring fantasy writers who are looking to create their own enchanting worlds?
Advice is difficult for me. My normal piece of advice, which is going to sound really strange, is not to take too much advice. And I think I partly answer that because I'm very bad at giving advice, because I think everybody writes so differently. But I feel like there's a lot of writing advice out there that's very prescriptive. Like it'll say things like, you have to write 1,000 words a day to be a writer. And for me, that's really not the case. So I think always take advice as a guideline rather than like a rule, which is not particularly great advice, but that's all I've got for you.
No, I think this is sort of like advice on advice that also builds on what Samantha said, but like everyone's brains work differently. And the best advice comes from authors whose brain works like yours. And you do not necessarily know what that is until you try everything out. So I think when you're starting out, it's definitely worth it to try everything out, but also with the understanding that this author may not be like me, but let me go around finding what really vibes with me. And sometimes you're really lucky and you find that author, you're like, oh my God, my process exactly like theirs. And that's sort of how you, I think like, those are some aha moments that you had. I've had aha moments throughout my life. I'm like, that is exactly like going to help me. So like I've really been building on like when I really like I really have to write about something I really, really, really love, which is why I'm having such a great time building this contemporary fantasy world, because it's going to be absolutely insane. And I used to like not love world building that much, but I was like, I love world building this one. So I think it makes a big difference for me personally.
I will say along those lines, what works for you at some point in your life might change. And that's something that I had to learn for myself when I was like, I have all the things that work perfectly. I have my plot system, I have my drafting system. And then I realized somewhere along the way, like, oh shoot, like those things aren't working for me anymore, or they aren't working for this particular book, and maybe they'll work again later. So being flexible, I think, is important. On a different note, I also think it's really helpful to read widely. Fantasy is a massive genre, and I'd encourage you to read not just the big fantasy names that we all know, but also fantasy books by marginalized writers and fantasy books outside the age category you usually read, or even the fantasy subgenre that you usually read, because there are so many. And I also encourage consuming stories through like movies, TV shows, video games, because you never know what's going to spark an idea.
Yeah, I'm kind of like Samantha, and I think like all of us, is that I hate to give advice because I'm always thinking like this is going to be just straight garbage for like 80% of you. So I'll give my blanket advice that I give to beginning writers, no matter what you're writing. If you're writing fantasy, if you're writing contemporary, anything. And it sounds kind of harsh, but it's learn to finish. I know so many great writers who are extraordinarily talented, and they'll show me like 25 of the most amazing beginnings that I've ever read in my life. And then that's where it ends. They never manage to find their way to the end of a story. And finding the way to the end of a story is a skill that writers can develop, just like any other skill that we develop through trying and trying again. But don't let yourself get paralyzed during the process so that you just like peter out. Finding the end, you get better at it. Once you can recognize a shape of a story, you just have to get there. It doesn't matter what it looks like in a first draft, just get to the end, or we will never get to see your stories.
Yeah, actually, on that note, like I wrote a whole novel when I was 15 and it will never see the light of day. But it did teach me how to write a story and how to finish one. So that is really important. And that writing was still experience, even if I never got it published.
Yeah. I trunked 10 books or 9 books before I got a published book. And I will always say to this day, there's no such thing as wasted writing.
I'm going to open it up now to a few live questions. So if you have questions that I have not asked our panelists, and you can get into book-specific questions, please drop them in the comments, and Myra is going to share. I found all of this really helpful, and I know, Kendare, you said that it wouldn't be good for 80% of people, but I am this person who's sometimes like paralyzed by fear in like many things that I do. I might not seem like I have a lot of fear, but I do. I live in a constant state of anxiety. And for me, I've always wanted to write, and I struggle getting past that like 30% of a story because I just start second guessing myself. And I've heard from so many authors who've said, just finish your work. And I need to start taking that to heart. I need to start finishing my stories.
I still get paralyzed now, like even after 10 years, like I'm
Yeah.
so nervous about finishing my current project because I'm like, what if I get the ending wrong? Because I'm in the middle of a series and I'm like, the ending needs to work for the rest of the series to work. So that does make me nervous. We definitely don't lose that fear.
I do want to say, I almost always think that my first drafts are hot garbage, but I tell myself that it's okay for it to be hot garbage, and I keep reminding myself that all the way through the end. And, you know, like 8 out of 10 times when I go back to read it, I'm like, oh, this isn't nearly as bad as I thought it was. I mean, obviously it needs work, but this isn't, you know, this isn't so bad. So I hope that is hopeful because I have to remind myself of that often.
And I think also another beginning writer thing that I think people tend to trip up upon is that they try to put everything into one book, and you really don't have to. And that is sometimes a problem, that you go on to too many tangents. Like, oh, I didn't close this up or close this up. Sometimes you actually have to just excise that all away. Like the main problem getting from beginning to end is that, you know, it should always be like whatever is at the beginning should be like running toward the end. And it should like, so you have to make sure that arc is solid. That at every point, you're getting there.
I just had a really relevant question come in off the back of the imposter syndrome we were talking about. Alita Marshall would like to know, how do you deal with feeling like your writing isn't worth reading, let alone publishing?
I think you really need to surround yourself with a good community and a good group of friends. And it's not always easy to find at first, but like once you find your people, I think it makes a huge difference. And I don't like, I have a pretty like small group that I work with that I like really trust. So it doesn't have to be a lot, but like, you know, like when you, like hopefully you find really amazing creatives to work with. That's just really important overall.
Also, just know that you may be your hardest critic. I just, when Gabe said that he like goes back and thinks, you know, like, hey, this isn't so bad. I am completely the opposite. I'll finish a draft and be like, yeah. And then like 6 weeks later, I'll read it and be like, this is straight trash. What am I doing? But, you know, it might be just that feeling that you're dealing with, and it's not true. So yeah, if you're doubting yourself, get another set of eyes on it. You know, it's probably just in your head.
I really relate to that roller coaster. Like I remember when I was working on A Day of Fall and Night, and I was swinging wildly between feeling like I was drowning in, because it's such a massive book, I just felt like I was drowning in words sometimes. And half the time I'd be like, this is the worst thing that anyone's ever written. No one has ever written anything worse than this. But then I would wake up the next morning and I'd be like, this is fantastic. Like, wow, you are a genius. Amazing. So yeah, I'm never emotionally stable with my books at all.
And I think all of us have written for many, 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 many years. And you go through these ups and downs. And at some point you're like, okay, yeah, I've been through this 10 times before. It'll go back up at some point. And you just have to trust that.
Yeah.
I've had 2 questions now at the end, and this will be our last question for the panel, but it's wonderful. So if Pages and Ink and Pertinent Postmortem, which is a great username, by the way, ask, how do you start a book? Like, how do you begin so that you can go on and finish it?
So honestly, I write like a bunch of words and then I cut it out. So it was like an absolute horror on my, I took one writing class in college, and the absolute horror when I said, I was like, oh, I just cut out like the first 20,000 words. Across the class, they're like, 20,000 words? This is a short story class. So understandably, that didn't really make sense. But I was like, okay, but I usually write novels. So, because I do think like when you're first building the world, I think it's just it's easier to write for yourself. And you're like, yeah, all this stuff, it probably is happening. It's probably not important for the reader to know later, but like if I don't write it now, I'm not going to know it. Like you have to build your own Wikipedia article, basically. And then I think like once you write a bunch of words, you're like, that's where I need to start. And everything you've written before, it's not like, even if you cut it, it's not like useless. You're probably going to use it somewhere later. But you probably need that discovery portion first, and then during that discovery portion, you're gonna find out.
Yeah. So I think for me, beginnings are something that I've always found that has come more easily to me than some of the other stuff. But when I find, even if I'm not sure where to start, I always start with my inciting incident and tell myself, okay, now what's half a step or a step back from this? And sometimes that means building something new, but oftentimes I find that for me, at least, when, as I said, a lot of my story ideas come with like an initial image of like this character somewhere doing something. And I'm often able to kind of like build off of that and figure out how this connects to the inciting incident. So once I can figure out what is going to be the major incident that's going to kick off the story, I then think, how does this connect back to the original image I thought of? Or how does this connect back to some sort of beginning? Like what is half a step back? What happened a day before this or a week before this, depending on how the story goes, and how do those things connect?
For me, I really try to nail that first line, because once I've got the first line, it helps me establish the voice that I'm going to be using, which I find really important. Like with the Bone season, I had this really strong line come into my head. It was just, I like to imagine there were more of us in the beginning. And I'd never written in first person before then, but the character's voice came so strongly into my head as I. And just once I had that first line, the rest kind of just followed quite easily. Same with A Day of Fallen Night. It was always, her name was Dumai, from an ancient word for a dream that ends too soon. And once I had that, I was like, I know this character now. Like there's a lot of story just contained in that opening line. So once I've kind of tweaked and messed around with that opening line for a while, that really helps the story get flowing for me.
That is a good tip. That's a good tip.
I can write that down.
For me, finding the beginning of a story is part of my front end mental labor. So I'm a pantser. So I've been usually thinking about a story before I write it for about a year minimum. And by the time that the first 3-ish chapters are in my brain, that's when I know it's time to start. I like to give myself that much of a runway to trust the rest of my pantsing. So if I've got 3 chapters worth, I'll be like, well, by the time I get to the end of the 3rd chapter, the 4th will have probably filled in, and then the 5th and the 6th, and you just go on faith. So I don't know, just maybe try playing a lot of it out in your head and seeing where you keep going back to. Every time you think about your story, where do you go first?
I feel like that's also kind of like drafting, but you just kept it all in your head instead of like writing it out on a doc.
Yeah, like I don't want to commit. Right?
Yeah.
I feel this very hard. I'm the same way. Thank you to everybody who's joined us this afternoon, this evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you, Samantha, for joining us from the UK. This was amazing. I know that everybody in the comments has said that they need to rewatch this to absorb everything, and that this has been wonderful advice. And we're just glad that we got to facilitate this here at OwlCrate-A-Con. I will remind everybody that our next live panel this evening will be with myself and Corey from Team OwlCrate, because we're going to go live about crafting communities. We're going to teach you the ins and outs of community, what makes them tick, and how to build your own book club. And it'll be really fun because I'm about to drop a very cool new program that we have here at Team OwlCrate. I'm very excited about it, and there will be some lucky, very lucky winners who tune into that live. Gabe, Gina, Samantha, Kendare, thank you so much.
Thank you.
For everybody else, I hope to see you at 6 p.m.